An amazing professor and author. Passionate. That was not how it was. Has ever asked professor John and author. And the panel was made up. My talk tonight, I want to quote statistics. Federation in the United done by a man. I want to quote statistics. And this particular man, Stephen M. Cohen, a leading Jewish sociologist, was forced out of his tenured position at HUC, my alma mater, in 2018 amid allegations of sexual assault and harassment that dated back decades. We all certainly knew when I was there. He would make or break women's careers while subjecting them to inappropriate touching, sexual advances, and violating questions. Since 2006, women have made it to the top echelons, and there are female heads of Jewish federations. Today, as you well know, we have a female vice president, but we also know that these are exceptions to the rule. And far too often, the fact that one or a handful of women are in traditionally male-dominated space is used as proof that sexism is no longer an issue and therefore not something we need to work on anymore. When the conservative movement began to ordain female rabbis, they had a problem. Male rabbis are obligated in what's called positive time-bound mitzvot, whereas women are not, right? Because if you have to do it at a certain time, someone needs to watch the kids. So only men were obligated in these. So what were they going to do? They decided that they would only ordain women who said they would take on the mitzvahs that were only obligated to the men. And I think, how perfect. Yes, these women became rabbis, but only by conforming to the male ideal of what it means to be a rabbi. So it is often in society, too often. Women who make it to top positions do so by trying to make the shoes of the man who stood there before them fit, instead of bringing her own, heels or flats. We're made to feel guilty about taking time off for the kids, and guilty about not taking time off for the kids. We're made to feel at once too attractive and not attractive enough, not strong enough, but when we're strong, we're shrill or bitchy. I said that on camera. But I will let Kerri get to those things. I just want to talk about two feminist figures in Judaism very briefly, Vashti and Esther. We encounter Vashti in chapter 1 of the book of Esther, right? This is the famous queen. And we learn the following about her. She is beautiful, she is headstrong, she throws a good party, and she refuses to demean herself by dancing naked in front of a bunch of drunk men. For this last offense, Vashti pays dearly, either losing her crown or her life. Esther, while appearing to do what any man asks her to do, proves to be a leader in her own right, and a successful one at that. She assumes control of Mordecai's plan to save the Jewish people, ordering him and all the Jews to fast with her for 3 days. Instead of following Mordecai's suggestion and simply making her petition to the king, she throws a series of parties. She uses her role as docile, subservient queen and sex object to get exactly what she wants and saves the Jewish people. For too long, our choices have been stand up for yourself and lose your crown, join the men and exploit yourself to get success, or just take it like a man. But we are not men, and we all lose when we cannot be authentic and when we have to play a game to get ahead. There is a wonderful midrash in Genesis Rabbah. It tells us of a very observant, righteous couple, but they've been married for over 10 years, and so they can no longer stay married because they need to have children. So he goes and he marries a wicked woman, and he becomes wicked. She goes and marries a wicked man and changes him so that he becomes righteous. And I'm quoting Genesis Rabbah. This shows, the rabbi said, that everything depends on the woman. Obviously, this is a lesson that the world still has to learn. So we are very excited this evening to be able to have a discussion, and I know Kerri very much wants it to be a discussion about the glass ceiling, about ways that women are held back or even hold ourselves back. Kerri, besides being a wonderful friend, mother, and congregant, is also a professor of law at the Florida International University College of Law. She has been named a top scholar by FIU. She has published extensively on issues of employment discrimination. She graduated from Columbia College, Columbia University with a BA magna cum laude, and from New York University School of Law. She has many, many articles published online. And this evening, we're going to be discussing her book, Pains of the Glass Ceiling, The Unspoken Beliefs Behind the Law's Failure to Help Women Achieve Professional Parity. So let's welcome Kerri Stone.
Hello? Yeah. Hi, thank you all so much for coming. I didn't get an introduction, so I'll just do my own. I have been described by the New York Times as a subscriber. That's pretty much the extent of me. I have the great pleasure of being a friend of Kerri Stone, and apparently a really big legal nerd who enjoyed reading this book on the beach this weekend, much to the dismay of my children. But I couldn't put it down, and I'm not just saying that. Like, it's a fascinating read for lawyers and non alike. And what's striking to me most about it is when you, hopefully in the context of this conversation that we have today, you can understand some things that maybe you didn't realize about your own reactions, about your own interactions. And the goal, I think, of Kerri's scholarship, and I'm certainly not going to speak for her because she's considerably more eloquent than myself, is to make us aware so that we can affect the change that needs to happen. So I just want to start with the end. As I understand it, Kerri, and I apologize, as I said, she's more eloquent. I tend to use a lot more words. Your goal is to make people aware of how societal attitudes, beliefs, and taboos inform prejudice, discrimination, and harassment at every level, so as to understand how policy has been shaped or misshaped, as the case may be, to enable broad destructive institutional failures.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
I hate to say in short, because there's nothing short about that. But
It's a long book, but first of all, Rabbi, thank you so much. That was so beautiful. Michelle, thank you so much for sitting next to me. You are a brilliant lawyer, and we are so lucky to have you tonight and always. So the book really tries to reimagine the discourse around the glass ceiling. There have been so many traditional attempts to say, you know, where are we? Where do we want to be? Why aren't women and other groups? There's so much, we're going to talk about this, but there's so much we're not going to be discussing tonight. Women are one group, but there's so many groups that are not proportionately represented at the highest levels and echelons of power, prestige, and compensation in the workplace. And that's the crux of what I teach, and trying to get at the why, and try to solve the problem using an out-of-the-box approach. So the approach really is to look at the unspoken beliefs that inhere in society, things that are so taboo that nobody would say them out loud, but they exist, and there's evidence that they exist. So to further that, and this is a springboard for conversation. It is not exhaustive. It's a beginning. It's not an end. And I would like to see. They're doing a micro symposium on the book at FIU in the fall, and they're inviting other scholars to come and publish their own pieces sort of inspired by or in response to. And I would love to see people appropriate the framework and attack this and other problems from this angle. So the angle is basically you identify the belief that nobody is saying out loud. You give it a voice so that you can confront it, because the invisibility is sometimes the most pernicious part. You establish that it exists, because I always tell my students you have to have evidence, you can't just say it. And there are ways to do this. And what I try to do in the book is to use both anecdotal evidence. So if there's a big headline or a news story, and sometimes you'll see them in the book and you'll be like, oh, I forgot that happened, but he did say that, or, you know, they did do that, or, you know, so there are these little anecdotes that dot the landscape of our cultural zeitgeist. And then there's the stats. I really tried to dig into research. There are psychological studies. There's a whole field of industrial organizational psychology that really looks into surveying what are people's attitudes in and toward the workplace. So really substantiating that, you know, this belief or some belief along its spectrum exists, and then tying that belief to certain failures. Why didn't Congress pass this law that would have helped? Why didn't the courts interpret this word in this law that does exist in a way so that so many cases don't fall through the cracks? What's broken about our system that doesn't incentivize people to vindicate their rights and feel safe doing so? All of these questions, and even down to the micro levels of, you know, the HR exec. Where are we failing? Why aren't we able to use the statutes we have for proper redress? And then so each chapter and I called it Panes of the Glass Ceiling because the pun is, you can't resist a good pun, right? But it really is kind of a protracted metaphor. It really is this idea of these layers of glass, and you can kind of, at the beginning, you can sort of see through, you can see the light, but if you stack enough of them up, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts, and you stop being able to see, you know, where you could even wind up, and you are limited. So each chapter is sort of organized along those lines, with identifying the beliefs, establishing the presence of the beliefs, identifying and expounding upon the legal problems caused by the beliefs, and then sort of taking what can we do about this? How should we approach this? And people can take it from there. So,
excellent. So what I found most striking and unique about Kerri's book was the way that she explained it, because I love metaphor, and that's how my brain works. And we've heard the glass ceiling over and over and over again, but the way that Kerri describes is stacking of those panes. So it's no longer clear which piece cut you and which was the fatal blow, but it was pain after pain after pain after pain that, as you know, we talked about at the beginning, you may or may not even be aware is happening as it's happening, or even after the fact. So what I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, Professor, is there's a lot of really cool legal stuff in here, which I have been asked to not do. You're welcome. That's a Kerri Stone, because She wants you to stick around. But it's really fascinating, and not just because the law is ever changing and it's so fluid in terms of who's making those decisions at what time and what environment with which litigants before them.
Her notes, by the way, like if you are a lawyer or you want to be a lawyer, stick around for office hours because I want to be in her study group.
They're color-coded. Don't be impressed. But I do want to talk. So the way that Kerri breaks it down is to each chapter, she said, was a pain. So I kind of want to hit up the ones that are the least legal, so we can have you guys engaged and hopefully participating as well. So the first pain, and Kerri very cleverly couches them in, I'm not using this word badly, in a cliche that we hear again and again and again, and every time we hear it, we go, like babysitting your kids. You can't babysit your own kids. Gary is with the kids, being a dad. He's not babysitting them.
They're
and
literally his, yes.
Okay, you can't babysit your own kids. Okay, so the first one, women are the downfall of men, right? So we have a huge spectrum here. And I'm going to kick it off with the one syllable, and hopefully you can take it from there.
Okay.
Pence.
Okay, so this is not a political book, and this will not be a political discussion. However, some of you might remember, well, that in the headlines a few years ago was a famous quote by then Vice President Mike Pence, that he was very proud that he would not be seen at an after-work social event or dinner with a woman who was not his wife. And that was meant to inspire, or maybe it did in some people inspire, feeling that he is very loyal and this is somehow very noble. But what it actually did was it was very revealing. Because there have been studies, and I've collected those studies in the book, and I'm being kind of cutesy with the titles. Women are the downfall of men. Obviously, people aren't going to walk around saying that or copping to believing that. But think about it. You do have this phenomenon that's been documented, that's been captured in corporate America, where right around that time and kind of leading up to that time, you had swaths of men that were sort of quietly avoiding being alone with women who weren't their wives. And sometimes it was a big client event, sometimes it was a conference, sometimes it was just a lunch or a dinner. It could be a mentoring session, and people got more and more comfortable. This is actually kind of an exceptional one, because this is the one I've heard the most. A lot of these people will not say, but this one I've heard, where, let's keep the door open, ha ha ha, and it's, what does that say? So in other words, there's a spectrum of beliefs out there. There are probably a small number of men who may not trust themselves. That's kind of weird, but whatever. And there may be more men that don't trust other people around them, which weird, okay. But if you actually look at studies that have been done, that have been published in places like Forbes and the New York Times, men have admitted to a variety, a spectrum, an array of beliefs, ranging from, I don't trust us, to I don't trust other people not to make things up about us, to I don't trust her if things go badly for her and she needs to weaponize a meeting that we had against me at some future point, and I need to protect myself. That's been a common refrain. So it's not pretty and it's not fun to talk about, but it actually has been voiced. And so that's kind of capturing, and I give that's probably the most famous example anecdotally, but then you have the research that backs this up. And you tie this idea that somehow if you're alone with a woman, or if you have an intense closed-door meeting or a lunch, that something somehow is going to bounce back and blow up on you. And you attach that to, well, what's the fallout from that? So let's follow this through. So the chapter walks us through, well, now you have women who aren't being mentored the same way. Maybe they're having their evaluations with an open door and it's a quick meeting, and nobody wants to be too tough on them. Nobody wants, and I've done interviews and I've done research, and there's all these stories, there's cases. I didn't want anyone to see her leaving my office crying, so I went easy on her. But now I want to tell you why we fired her, because that's what these cases boil down to when discrimination cases come up later. So you have women who aren't being mentored. You have women who aren't being given entree and access into client events, into opportunities, who aren't being showcased, who aren't being put out there to be noticed, to be discovered. And this goes on, and I go into it in a lot more detail in the book, but that's kind of an example, right? It goes off in so many different directions. But we haven't really sat down and said, is there this belief out there that somehow, in some way, she's going to be your downfall? if you're hard on her, if you close the door, if you mentor her very intensely, if you're seen working late with her 3 nights a week, if you take her to a work dinner, and what's the cost? And then you have all these different levels of cost that have been assessed by the psychologist. So you kind of look at that evidence and you say, well, they're not doing as well because nobody's telling them what to do. And they're not holding themselves to the same standards because they're not being forced to. And maybe they're just kind of bored because they're not getting to go to the event, so they're going home early. So then some of it at a certain point, now they're taking ownership of it. So it's really this very rapid downhill spiral.
And I think that's probably something that everyone in the audience can relate to, an experience where you felt, well, what will people say, or how will this be perceived? And I think it leaves the question, how do we identify it? How do we fix it? What's next?
Well, I think, again, the more we talk about this, the more it's, and this is true, the more it's going to hit everybody's ears funny when people do articulate it, right? And this is one of the ones that people do say. So the next time someone's, oh, we'll just keep that open, and maybe someday in some office someone will say, well, why? You didn't keep it open with him. It's so we can do whatever we need to do to get me to the next level here. And that's hard, and it's hard to do for yourself. And we talk about just like kids in high school, right? Workplaces are just high school kids grown up. So it's bystanders and upstanders and things that hit your ear a certain way, and you realize, oh, that's not okay anymore. And sometimes just having these discussions will make it hit someone's ear differently, and sometimes that's all you can hope for.
I think so too, and I think it's also verbalizing a trust that you have, and if you find yourself in that situation, feeling empowered enough to say, I'm going to close the door because there are sensitive things that we're talking about, and not asking permission to do it, and keeping your chin up and demanding that same respect, because really no one's going to give it to you. And there are nice ways to do it, which is another pain, right? So that goes into the second one I wanted to talk about. Just be grateful that you're here. Make everything nice and pretty for everyone, and don't make too many waves.
Yeah, so there's a lot of iterations to this one, but that's one of the chapters, because again, it's not something that you hear said to women in modern corporate or any American workplace. Just pipe down and be grateful you're here. But it takes different forms, right? So the idea that we engage in gender performance, and again, I just want to be clear, this book is about sex, it is about gender. There's racial performance, there's religious performance that people expect and that we feel societal pressure to do, but there's performance in every job. I, as a professor, cannot get away with some of the stuff that my male colleagues get away with. And to be fair, there are certain ways that I can use humor and warmth in the classroom that people might raise eyebrows if some of them did. And that's not fair, but it exists, and it's built kind of into the curtains, into the furniture, the way sort of invisible structural discrimination is. So people's expectations of us will be different. If I assert myself in a certain way, it's going to be perceived maybe differently by someone, and maybe they'll be aware of it, and maybe they won't, and maybe they'll say something about it, and maybe they won't, and that's why this is so hard, and these answers are not going to come easy.
So one of the things that you talk about in this chapter that was just, I really hadn't thought of it in this way, but whether you've been in a work situation or like a volunteer, whatever it is, the women are in charge of the birthday card for the office, and the women are in charge of the birthday cake, and the women are in charge of setting up the mentoring programs. And these are not paid positions. There's no glory here. There's no appreciation. There's rarely a thank you. And the women don't do it for a thank you. They do it generally because they're asked, or actually a word that I learned through patio was you're being voluntold.
That's right, you taught me.
Right, which is someone else volunteered you, you're welcome. And women, as a result of that, are put in positions where there's a lot of time and energy expended without any value.
Yeah.
They're not put in front of the decision-making partners. They're not given time in front of the clients. They're not given any new skills that can be used in their practice or whatever their work is. So I thought that was really interesting as well. I'm just searching through here because, can I throw out some?
Please.
Okay. So in Kerri's book, she has a lot of really great statistics. So with this additional unpaid, unrecognized emotional labor, which is also known as invisible labor, women are 48% more likely to actually volunteer, 44% more likely to be voluntold. And this was interesting. Women asked to volunteer say yes 76% of the time. So you talked about paying your dues versus knowing when to say no. And I think that's really interesting too.
Well, the dues cost more if you're a member of certain groups. And again, it's all identity performance. It's how we're expected to perform. It's how we expect ourselves. You know, if there's, who wants to take notes, it's, we feel that. We tend to. And I'm general.
What happens if a woman complains about doing a task like that?
First of all, she's in that position, right? If she's always the one being asked, then she has to be the one to kind of say no, and now she's the one who said no. If someone isn't asked, it's a non-issue. But she may be perceived as difficult.
Petty.
Yeah.
Whiny.
Yeah.
Bratty.
But it's the
better than.
Yeah.
All of these things, right? And it's up and up and up. And, a man can generally get up and leave a conference room, and it's expected that the women are going to, clean up the crumbs. And there were some really great quotes that you had in the book of women who said, I'd love to help, but I have a meeting. A way of saying thanks, but I'm actually just as important. There was another one in there too.
I'm trying to remember.
They were great. I don't know. I love nothing more than a witty woman. It's just...
Or just something effective, just something that'll work. The invisible part, though, is really, because we don't talk about it. We don't say, I'm going to line up these 3 women and one of them will take the notes. We don't designate. So a lot of people don't even see it. And that takes us to the rabbi's point that I wanted to go back to. Those of us who were, let's say, in high school or beyond in the 90s will probably remember Zoe Barrett and Kimba Wood, who were nominated for very prestigious positions. And their downfall, they so-called nanny gate, right? Because it came to light that they had hired people without going through the proper protocols to watch their kids. And that's what we talk about. And I'm not getting into whether that is what it is. How many times has a man stood before a Senate committee and had someone say, and who was watching your children while you did all these wonderful things that we're reading about here today, sir? They don't ask. They don't ask, it doesn't come up, it's invisible. And so again, by giving voice, by looking at it from this other point of view, by breaking down that fourth wall, hopefully if we can't change everything, we could at least just start to get people's minds working differently.
Absolutely. You also go into, this chapter is really quite phenomenal. You go into the power of, like Rabbi Greengrass was saying, a woman stands up and says something, okay, and then a man says literally the same thing. Yes, and that happens, I can tell you, it happens in law practice and it happens in volunteer, Mr. President. It happens really across the board, to the point where women are told, just let him make this presentation. The clients will react better if it comes from him. They can relate to him more. Well, how do you fix that? You have the client as a female, right? Or better yet, you have a world in which that relationship doesn't have to be us or them. It's all of us together, right?
And that's why, and again, if the population of the bench is very homogenous, it's going to hit people more, the things that they hear will hit them more in the same way. If the population of the board of directors is more homogenous, it's the same thing. If you have a woman or person of color or somebody who's not traditionally in those seats, they'll see it. They'll hear it. They'll say the quiet part. They'll see the invisible part, and that's how it's going to change.
Absolutely. So the third pane that I loved. We expect you to take your punches like a man. And this goes to the courts being reluctant to legislate civility, as you said. They don't want to play hall monitor, which is understandable. And every situation is different and involves so many different factors. But there's something to be said for women can't take a jab like a man. And I think one of the reasons they can't and they shouldn't be asked to is if someone says something derogatory to a woman is coming from a place with a history where something might be triggered, or they could believe that there was truth in what that person was saying, or they thought they could very easily think that that's going to affect their job, their position, their value, their whatever, and thinking that person, there's a degree of truth in what they're saying. Whereas a man, if you joke around with him from that same perspective, with the privilege of not having that long history, could just take a joke. And I think, I'm certainly not going to say women don't have a sense of humor. I mean, I think the best comics are women. They do have a sense of humor.
You're the funniest person I know.
That's a tragedy. That's actually a tragedy. But my point is simply, women can't take a punch like a man because they're not similarly situated. My question for you, wait, I'm getting there, hang on. I'm here, okay. So my question for you, Professor Stone, is this a product of men and women being socialized differently? Or is this because there is a window to the psyche that those jokes might open?
Okay, can I do a quick legal lesson? And if I get boring, you guys just stop me. I can do this so quickly because I want to put this like crystal for you guys. There are protected classes. The laws protect certain groups, right? Race, color, religion, sex, national origin, disability, age, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you fall into one of those classes and somebody's really nasty to you in a way that touches upon your protected class membership, it's called harassment. We all know sexual harassment, there's religious harassment, there's disability, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, that's actionable. You can take that to court. What is not actionable, and this is exactly what we've been talking about, is this notion of the status neutral bully who's just a big jerk to everybody. So this is really about workplace bullying. And the idea has always been that workplace bullying is considered to be perfectly lawful. And again, the genteel conversation around it is, well, if you don't like it, just go somewhere else. The laws are there to protect protected classes, and that's necessary. But if it's just a civility thing, that's not the proper role, right? It's cabined to protecting these underrepresented classes. So if someone's just a generic big jerk, maybe it's not the right place for you. And it's so easy, it's so convenient, and it sounds good, right? It has some surface appeal. And what Michelle's getting at really brilliantly is this idea, and this is stuff I've written about. We have books that have been written. We have studies that have been published. And again, we're generalizing a bit, but boys and girls are acculturated and socialized differently, which is the answer to your question. So if you and again, all people at work are just people who graduated from high school, right? It's just, we're just a little older, right? It's the same dynamics. It's the same thing. And a lot of people also say, oh, we don't need anti-bullying laws. That's stuff that goes on a school playground. That's not something that we need to protect our workers from. If they don't like it, they can leave. And we have this like very mythical notion of this American worker that's very rugged and will find the right place and has all this mobility, and that's just not reality. So what you have is, if you have the status neutral bully, I think it's a fallacy to say that because there have been studies, right, that even the status neutral bully goes for people who they can push the buttons on more. And that tends to be people who don't react as well. That tends to be women. Little girls tend to be acculturated and socialized differently. Don't talk back, don't get into a confrontation, don't show ugly, just be nice, be nice, be nice. Now what that also does, and if any of you have read the book that I cite to pretty heavily in my book, Queen Bees and Wannabes, it's actually, I think the book Mean Girls was based on, it actually incentivizes that kind of teaching. Well, okay, but I have to protect myself, so I'll just go behind their back and I'll do it behind and I'll gossip. And you can see the differences when there are girl problems and boy problems. That doesn't change as we get older. So somebody who gives it back to the bully, who takes him or her on squarely and just is funny about it or lets it bounce off of them or insults him back, may win respect, ironically. And that person is more likely to be a man. Whereas somebody who goes and cries behind the office door and calls their best friend and absorbs it differently is not going to necessarily fare as well if we've got this ideal American worker in our head. And again, lots of generalizations, but there are studies, and you can connect it to the premature winnowing away, right? We have these firms, we have these companies, the failure to retain smart, talented people. There are women who there have been interviews with women who say, I had a baby and I didn't want to go back. And they don't really, and it's their choice. And they'll tell you it's their choice. But if you went back and looked at what was going on at that workplace, there were reasons that she didn't want to go back. There were reasons she wasn't comfortable. Oh, did you want to?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Please.
I know this is a discussion, so I don't know.
Yeah, go ahead, yes.
Thank you so much for this. I was just curious, with the workforce changing as rapidly as it is right now and Gen Z coming into play, are you seeing those studies or the results from those studies changing?
We're waiting on a lot of the studies. I'm seeing my law school kids on the ground, and they're filling me with a lot of hope because they're aware of a lot that again, hasn't been realized or spoken by previous generations. So I am hopeful. I'm hopeful about a lot of things when it comes to protected classes. I think that's a great question. But I still will say a couple years ago, and again, like pop culture, right? Do you guys remember that commercial? They brought in like a bunch of people, men, women, old, young, girls, boys. They said, run like a girl. And everyone did that same stupid run. Why do we do that? Why is that? Like, what, and it's not our fault, but that's what's in our heads. So when you engage in the identity performance of what you think someone is, you're acting out what you've been taught. And there's a chapter in stereotyping that kind of talks about that. I am hopeful. I am hopeful that they're going to see it, but we have to talk to them about it more. We have to have these conversations.
So the chapter that Kerri's talking about is we see you differently than we see men. And the question I had for Kerri is men and women and dogs and cats and mice are all guilty of stereotyping ourselves and others. Who is the we when we say we see you differently? Aren't women just as guilty, and what can we do? Because we need to fix it.
It's all of us, and it's not even like it's not even guilty because it's what we've been taught. I remember coming home. My husband and I had a joke when I went off to one of my clerkships because I had interviewed so long ago for it with Judge Fuentes, and I said, I hope I recognize him. And he's like, he'll be the one in the robe, and he took me to dinner the night that I started the job in New York, and he said, so did you figure out which one was him? And I said, yeah, he looks like a judge. What does that mean? What does that mean? Judge Fuentes looks like a judge. Like, he was an older guy, a gentle-looking person with kind eyes and white hair, and he wore a robe. But,
Judge Bernstein? Judge Young, do you want to do a twirl?
A judge. But we, again, psychologists will tell you that stereotyping is a natural cognitive function that enables us to mediate and make sense of the world around us by putting things in categories so that when we encounter them again, there's some recognizability and we understand how to better process them. So it's actually a very innocent feature of our brains. The problem is when negative, untrue, irrational stereotypes get attached to groups, and even positive. I do a chapter with my class. We talk about a case where an Asian woman was hired for a job at a lab, and at the interview they said to her, well, you'll do great here because Asian people work so hard, and then she was fired a month later for taking too many breaks. But that's the invisible lens, right? It doesn't matter if the stereotype is positive or negative. If it's stuck to you because of your protected class membership, it can be weaponized against you. And you are being seen through a different lens. And the question is, if that lens is invisible, how do you go to court? How do you walk in there and make out your case? And that's the problem, among many.
So we're at a point now, Kerri and I, thank you for standing up. Kerri and I have been talking for a long time. There are a lot more pain. Do you want me to keep going through the pains, or should we talk about the structural?
Whatever you do, you can do more pain, whatever you want.
Okay, so you know what I think?
Join her study group.
What's that?
Join her study group. She really,
so you know, maybe I can just briefly touch on the remaining pains. There are only, math is not my thing, 5 of them left. And then we can talk to some systemic discrimination and then hopefully
open it up
a little bit. You say that we have to, society says that we have to accept locker room and sexist talk. And, I'm not going to mention what the former president said on that bus. We all know what he said, but, as you're more eloquent than I am, you said it quietly erodes the dignity of many women over time. It's untargeted hostility that people are just too sensitive. And crassness is not regarded as actionable sexual harassment. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I'll do really quick because I want to hear what you're all thinking and have to say. But just really quickly, I did write about that incident, and it's funny, when I wrote about it, I wound up really focusing in on the Billy Bush character. If you guys remember, Billy Bush was about to do the interview, and he got in a lot of trouble many, many years later for laughing. And it was funny because I was talking about that with my class, and I had this one guy, and I could not explain. He would not accept my explanation of structural discrimination, that it's invisible, that it's built in, that it's part of society, that it's just there, and that it doesn't mean everybody, believes one thing, or, and we were talking about that, and the whole semester I couldn't get him to it, and finally, he raised his hand and he said, yeah, but that's not really fair, because that was funny then. And I said, that's exactly what I've been trying to teach you all semester. That's what, we are products of what's around us, of what the people around us think is acceptable or taboo or funny. And he got a lot of blowback for being an enabler, when in fact he was placed in a position that countless people are placed in every day in the American workplace. And there, again, psychological studies. People get along to go along. They laugh when they don't think the joke is funny. Again, members of any minority group can talk about that. It's very painful. So we give a voice.
And I think, if we're being honest, I think there are probably a number of women, when in the same position, would have laughed too, because you laugh when you're uncomfortable. And you laugh when you don't know what else to do.
When someone important's around who's made you maybe sign an NDA, like Harvey Weinstein. How did all that stuff happen? Shrouds and shrouds of secrecy.
Another pain that you get into is that women don't operate with full agency. And I thought this was really interesting as well. When you think about it's only the victim who acquiesces to the sexual harassment who then potentially has a colorable claim down the line. Because if a woman says no and quits, well, it's at-will employment. So you made your choice and you walked away. Where's the harm? Right?
She's doing the legal weeds, but she's totally right.
All right, translate that into English.
Oh, wow. That's hard. No, you did it perfectly. She's right. Everything she said is right. You just have to take our word for it. The law of sexual harassment treats victims differently if they actually capitulated and went along with the demands of the harasser, or if they just got fed up and quit. And if you trace back, as I did in one of my articles, and then as I tried to do again in the book, and you look at the history of women and agency and consent, when it comes, and I know we have kids here, so I'll try to be careful, but when it comes to certain things, you signed on the line, and even though it's 1800, you sold your husband's cow, and he's going to be really mad at you, and you're on the hook for it, versus when things involve more intimate levels of agency. Back in the day, they had the cause of action for seduction. And the cause of action did not belong to the woman, right? The unmarried woman. It belonged to her father or her husband, depending on the situation. So we've never had this sense in American history that women owned their own agency when it came to certain things, and we see that reflected in some major inconsistencies in the legal weeds that just trust us. They are, and they're reflected. I'm trying to think of the other. There are some other examples in there about agency. Look, dress codes, right? The male dress code is like a paragraph, like a few sentences, like try not to look sloppy. And with women, it has to be closed toe. And we had in New York, there was a whole thing about, you have to wear stockings, and we're going to check. And if you don't have a strap around the back of your heel, we can hear you clacking in the hallway. There's so much micromanagement of women's appearances that they can't be trusted to do it for themselves. And we see that with little girls. We see, dress codes at certain, and I don't mean like uniforms, I mean literal disparate standard dress codes at proms.
This isn't like a thing of the past. I joined the public defender's office in 2007. We could pretty much wear whatever we wanted, but the state attorney was pretty strict, and the women had to wear hose. Do you know how hot hose gets in Miami in the summer? It was ridiculous, but they had to wear hose, and
if there's a
attorney
rule,
was a woman.
Yeah. And if there's a rule, that means someone's watching. And it's this notion that we don't talk about, but women are not treated like they operate with full agency.
I would love to see one of those state attorney men in a hose. That's fun. Okay, so this kind of pairs with that. And we're not going to go political here, but speaking of agency over your own body, one of your chapters was "Don't burden us with your impending motherhood."
Yeah, again, an unspoken belief. People give a lot of lip service to how wonderful everything is, and it's a blessing, and it's this and it's that. But a lot of people in the workplace, when you look into their actions, and sometimes they'll say it, your pregnancy is sort of unsightly and inconvenient to them. And that's something we have to start talking about.
Don't let them know in an interview.
I mean,
Don't let the client see you. She's not going to want to, develop this relationship because you're going to be gone.
I interviewed students who told me that they walked into meetings and was like, how long are you going to be out? I need to know right now.
Well, can you focus?
Why didn't you tell me?
Do you need to stand?
I mean,
Do you need a comfort break?
we should take this on the road.
Really. But I actually, side note, I used it to my advantage. I was doing a murder trial. I was about 8 months pregnant with my little one, and she was kicking and kicking and kicking. And at the time, we weren't supposed to wear our public defender badges because we didn't want the jury to know that we were public defenders for a variety of reasons that I won't bore you with. But anyhow, we weren't supposed to wear them. But my senior attorney said, Michelle, keep it on. And I was like, why? He goes, every time the baby kicks, you are reminding the jury that you're a good, decent mother-to-be who can be trusted. So you wouldn't be sitting next to a guilty man, and you wouldn't be endangering your baby with this horrible human being. And I don't know if that was the only reason, but all right. Okay, this one. Ugh. We have to pay him more. He has a family to support.
That actually gets said, if you can believe it.
It got said to me.
Okay, right there. Didn't know that.
Yeah. So, and I'm sure in one way, or it's obviously no secret that women get, 77?
Maybe?
Something else.
Like that, yeah.
But that's really a fundamental underlying reason. It's assumed that the man is the primary breadwinner, and the women make,
and the
fun
law,
money.
yeah. And I tell my students all the time, behavior shapes the law, and the law shapes behavior. And it's this consubstantiality that goes around and around. So basically, we passed the EPA, the Equal Pay Act, which again, really quick legal lesson, equal pay for equal work. And then the conversation just shifts over kind of a hair, and they say, well, we have to come up with something else for him to do because he has family to support. That's easy.
And that also presumes that there's a man and a woman in the relationship. That presumes that there's a marriage in a relationship.
Yep.
And all of that, again, is chains of the patriarchy, right?
Yeah.
Which are
No, and there's stuff in the book. I went back and even there was quotes from like Frances Perkins, one of the first labor secretaries, talking about this idea that women who worked back in days of yore, were perceived as this sort of superfluous extra income. That it was just this cool hobby that she was able to do this, and either shame on her or good for her, but it was just this like weird extra thing that family was getting. So we don't have to worry too much about them.
So these are some interesting stats from the book. 1967. So, right, I don't want to say this wrong. The Civil Rights Act was 64.
Mm-hmm.
Civil Rights Act was in 64, so when Title VII was passed. 1967. 14.8 million women were working full-time in the workforce, compared to 36.6 million men. Only 15% of those women held management positions, so that was about 2.2 million. And those are just management positions, and that doesn't account for, in those management positions, how they were paid, treated, all of those things. So that's 1967. In 2021, women make up 46.5% of the workforce, and they're only in 8% of the top leadership. Somehow it's gone down substantially. That was shocking to me. And it's done in the landscape of laws that purport to protect women and to make things equal.
Yeah.
I'm certainly not blaming the laws, but what Kerri gets to is that it's not the laws that are the problem, it's the holes in the laws, and it's the lack of understanding of how we can all work together to address those holes that can't necessarily be said. So I actually want to go to, I'm quoting Kerri. Can I quote you to you? A wise woman once said, actually, before we get that, the last pane, and it's important, so I don't want to miss it, is the stray comments doctrine. Bad people don't do good things, but good people frequently say bad things. And of course, employment discrimination plaintiffs can't be fully trusted.
It's a big thing that we won't get into. It just has to do with what kind of evidence is admissible when you're looking at summary judgment motions. And certain things judges are very happy to hear because it lets them sort of, everyone loves a good redemption story. I mean, that's what I tell my students. That's what'll connect with, I think, most people. But that's not fair, right? But certain things that people may have said outside of the context of work cannot be brought in. And on one hand, and I give my students both sides, like the argument for that is, well, you should be able to go to a bar after work and blow off steam, and Title VII is not there regulating your thoughts and making you into a good person. On the other hand, if that's the only window and insight that's going to be yielded into this person's head, and at the crux of this case is their undisclosed mental intention, did they do this because of your protected class status, it's darn helpful, especially at the preliminary stages, but that's that.
So the conclusion that Professor Stone comes to is it is incumbent upon those who care about workplace equality for women to examine the nexus between unspoken and often encountered societal beliefs and injustices in anti-discrimination law and policy. And I think that's a great summary of all of the pains that you lay out and what we are now responsible for as well. So that's amazing. So
Open it up?
yeah, well, one sec. So, there were, sorry. I have more statistics. Yes, here they are. I promise this is, so anyone who's practiced law for like more than 30 seconds will tell you that when you're in court, you've lost, right? So the only people who win in court are the lawyers. So we don't want good plaintiffs. We don't want good cases. We want the problems fixed before we get there. So Kerri cites that there are 14,000 employment discrimination cases filed each year. Of those, 18% are dismissed on summary judgment, which is basically the judge saying you don't have a claim and kicks the plaintiff. That's 18%. And of those that go forward, only 2% of them, the plaintiff prevails. And that's how hard these cases are to prove. That's how hard they are to win.
Some settle, to be fair, but you're literally settling.
You're settling, and in that, try to find a lawyer who's going to take that on contingency with those, chances, and then you have a fear of retaliation. So, of the people who made claims and then said that they were being retaliated against, only 42% of those claimants survived summary judgment. So basically, if a woman or a person of color or a discriminated individual brought a claim, and it actually was one of the 18% that survived summary judgment, and they were retaliated against, right? I know this is kind of like taking it and taking it and taking it, but less than half of those, when they get retaliated against, even have a claim for retaliation. So it's like you're getting kicked when you're up and kicked when you're down and kicked when you're on the side, and it's ridiculous. So you have just the silencing, and then you also have a situation where these cases aren't going in front of a judge, so judges aren't ruling what's okay and what's not.
Yeah.
So you can't aerate the claim.
Totally.
So again, quoting Professor Stone, to the extent that these rules are tacit, the unspoken beliefs that underlie them are worth exploring, and voicing these unspoken beliefs may just be their vanquishing. So on that, it's beautiful. I'm telling you, this is beautiful.
I could listen to you read the phone books. You make everything sound good.
I don't even have a British accent. So I think on that, we can get into structural, individual, and systemic discrimination, and I can quote more stats, or
let's open it up.
Or we can open it up.
Let's open it up.
So I'm going to throw this out, and I would love someone to raise their hand. I was going to ask Kerri, but I'm going to ask you guys.
Do it.
Can we have professional parity without domestic parity? This is who's watching the kids versus working mothers' guilt. Anybody? Okay. Right? I mean, because this is a thing, right? Because we have these burdens that are put on us, and the pleasures too. I don't want to make it seem like all household chores are burdens. There's quite a bit of joy that you get from them, but there are things that are just not expected of one partner over the other. And I maybe say the primary homemaker as opposed to the primary breadwinner, because it's not always a man and woman, and it's not always, who's doing what. And I know plenty of couples where the husband takes all the calls from the school and all of these things, but it's few and far between. Kerri, for those of you who don't know, has an amazing husband, Josh, who gave up his practice of law in New York to come to Miami so that Kerri could live her dream.
My nerdy dream.
Her dream of becoming a law professor. And that's pretty extraordinary. There aren't a lot of men, especially in New York, especially lawyers, who would be willing to put their ego aside and to do that in support of their partner. And that's very, very special.
And it's more invisibility, right? Like when I did my teaching fellowship, everybody we interviewed was super qualified, and there's so many stars out there. And I tell my students this because I don't like them to feel like they're less than because of things that none of us are talking about and only some people can see. When we hired people, they had to be willing to take a very small stipend with no benefits to move to Philadelphia. If you have money, if you have a partner, if you have someone, if you don't have, kids yet, if you're a certain age, you're much better situated to accept an offer if you're given one for a stepping stone position like that. And if you have privilege and it's partially cloaked in some invisible stuff, I think it's important to talk about that so that everyone can see it,
Say that again. I have a question that's connected to this in a sense that it's related to parenting. So I know we talked about like socialization and how that is so different for little girls. And case study, I was a little girl. I felt the pressure to be very independent at a very young age. Another case study, I worked in education and I taught 3rd and 4th grade, and I found myself being a woman teacher where I would hold, specifically when I think about when you talked about how women are often the ones who take on like the birthday card, those things. I thought about how in my class of students, and if we were writing a thoughtful note for another teacher or for another student, I would push the girls to be a little more thoughtful in what they were writing. Whereas with the boys, sometimes it was like, well, at least they wrote more than one word. And left it at that. And now my next case study is that I am in the world of dating. And the only response to that should be, I'm so sorry, because it is rough out there. But what I'm finding is, I am interested in men, and so many of these men who I am going on dates with, they lack independence is the best and kindest way to say it. And I have to really think about parenting though. Part of the reason they lack this is because they were handheld through a lot of things in life, and I do think that boys are parented very differently than little girls. And so my question to you, and I think about this in the sense that I would like to have kids someday, I could be a boy mom someday, and I want to be really thoughtful about how am I parenting my young boys to be independent, to be thoughtful, to be just like we expect all girls to be. And so I'm wondering, with all the research that you did, are there conversations happening around parents and specifically mothers, and are they in the sense of are we fueling this cycle and these pains that we're seeing in the way that we are raising young boys?
So
this is totally Kerri's wheelhouse. I have 2 girls.
Yeah, I'm a boy mom. No, I love that you asked that, and I love the way you put all those together, because you're connecting them. Every generation does it a little differently and a little more up to date than the one before. So we're always evolving the conversation. I think in this way, and I think social media has been a disaster in a lot of ways, but I think in this way it's been helpful because there's a lot of social media on this, on boy moms and conversations, and even just quick little catchphrases. So if they're if they're wrestling or something, just saying something like, oh, we respect her body. How many people said that? And maybe some people did, but was that as common in 1960 and 1980 as it is today? And those little things, these little things stick. And going back to quickly what Michelle was saying before, there are very few cases. 14,000 is not a lot of cases in this great big country. There's a lot of employment wrongs and harassment instances and discriminate. They go on every day, like multifold more than that even brought, let alone what's actually going to trial. So what we count on the law to do is to protect the people who aren't situated, who can't find a lawyer, who aren't willing to, be Googled and have it come up that, and that's not fair that they should have to feel that way, but they do, and they're afraid, and they don't want to be that person. So there's this ripple effect, right? So people didn't know what sexual harassment was, but then a bunch of sitcoms in the 80s did a very special episode where somebody got harassed, and it just became this thing that was known. And we don't know how many times someone started to say something or someone said to someone, hey, that's not cool, or because they heard about it, even though it wasn't part of their lives. So these little blips, these little sayings, these little reframings that we can do and that I think people are doing more and more are really powerful. So I think we're on the right track there.
I look around to some wonderful friends that actually one is sitting, right there. Dr. Maltner is a brilliant surgeon.
Yep.
She saves lives every day, multiple lives. Some of us just push paper, but she's actually
Literally curing cancer.
Literally curing cancer. And she has a little boy and a little girl. And both of her kids see her put on her scrubs every day and go to work. And they see their dad support her, encourage her, admire her, respect her. And as a result, she has 2 children who are respectful of one another, who are engaged, intelligent, and treat each other as equals. I've never seen in your house Ari put down Silver or Silver put down Ari. So when you're saying how do you raise boys to be the kind of men you want to be, treat them like the kind of men they want to be, and marry the kind of man that, because, or woman or whatever, but the point is pick your partner very carefully, because this shit is hard.
Thank you. It's been
Another brilliant doctor back there, by the way.
Literally curing cancer.
it's been very insightful, but sort of along a similar line but different. I was listening as you were describing one of the pains of not being confrontational and just kind of acquiescing to diffuse tension. And I gave social advice to my 11-year-old, and I realized I completely fed into, when they were having a social interaction issue, I completely fed into that implicit stereotype of saying, just say we love you, everything's fine, go with the flow. And I recognize now that that is my own, the way that I was acculturated and taught to approach relationships, I guess, when there's confrontation. So what can we tell, because many of us are parents, what can we tell instead of the boys? I'm a girl mom in a house where girls rule, and I live with the biggest feminist in the world. What can we do differently? Like what would be one takeaway that would counter that pain?
Do you want to go first?
I prepared a list.
I wouldn't be surprised.
I swear, I actually did.
See?
So I just finished this amazing book. Okay, so there's this exercise thing called the Peloton. Some people are familiar with it. There's an instructor. She's beyond inspirational. Her name's Tunde Oyende, and she's a first-generation American. Her parents are Nigerian, I believe. She wrote a book that was so incredible. It's called Speak. I highly recommend it. I also highly recommend the Audible to hear her. It's incredible. Anyhow, so she kind of inspired these takeaway points. Be yourself. You will not find job satisfaction in a job where you're hiding who you are. And when it comes to girls, and listen, I'm only 9 years in, so I'm certainly not an expert. I make mistakes multiple times a day. The girls will tell you that. I come home and I talk about how much I love my job. I come home and I talk about how cool X, Y, or Z that I did. I read a book and I tell them about what's so interesting about it. We watch the news not the last week or so, but we talk about the cool things that are happening in the world and how they can do it. I had the pleasure of reading to my older ones, third grade class last week, and I was reading the first chapter of Harry Potter, which I think is like the greatest chapter in the history of literature. Save this incredible book, which I don't know, J.K. Rowling might be nervous. But the kids were so excited, and we were talking about invisible ink, and they were talking about what they could do and what they could explore. And it was really cool to get their STEM brains working on the world is their oyster, and there's nothing that they can't do. And we just have to constantly remind them that, especially sitting here in this beautiful campus looking at this gorgeous new school. We're arming them with every opportunity in terms of education, experience, perspective, and it's up to them to use it, you know, and we need to encourage them to use it. Really quick.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to know your own worth and demand it. If you allow yourself to be treated like shit, sorry, you're going to be treated like shit. If you stand up, and you don't have to be a snob, and you don't have to be a brat, and you don't have to be high maintenance or any of these other horrible words that we use to describe women, but if you know your worth, you need to set that standard for yourself. And finally, make room. Make room in your heart, make room in your life, and make room in your calendar to mentor the next generation. So don't be afraid if there's someone that you respect or admire to give them a call and say, hey, can we have coffee? Can I just Zoom you? Can I talk to you about this? And I guarantee you, women do like to help women. We just have to have an opportunity for it.
No, totally. I'll just quickly say every good mom that I know has said some version of what you just said, that they're hearing themselves and they're rethinking certain things, and I think that's great. I'd also say we also have to go a little easy on ourselves. I mean, look, there are big things. There are jokes that our kids are going to hear, and they're going to have to be the one in the room to be like, that's not funny, and here's why. And that's so hard. And there are times that they're going to get hurt, and they're going to have to turn to their best friend and say, that actually really hurt my feelings. That was not cool. And that's hard. I think sometimes you have to, and that line's in a different place in every situation for every person, but you know, sometimes you look around and the expectations of everybody else around you has to kind of make you feel comfortable too. So sometimes, depending on what the thing is, it's not crazy to say, you know what, it's not worth it. Just, you know, at this, you know, she knows she hurt you. You know, if she asks you, is it 100% fine, and she needs to hear that, throw her a bone. You know, like, and I know that's not perfect, but we're not perfect. And sometimes, you know, we do make things, you know, we have to make things easy on our kids. They can't always be that person. So I think we should also be kind to ourselves as we're sort of picking and choosing, and also choosing who we surround ourselves with so that we are more comfortable saying how we really feel and teaching our kids to say it. But if they find themselves in a situation where people aren't receptive and are making them feel uncomfortable, like, cut bait where you gotta cut, and that's hard. It's hard, and it's so individualized, but I think we have to reckon we all do it, and we all do it because we're practical people that want to get along in the world, and it just depends on which battles you pick.
I think that's right, and building up the confidence of you and your children, because if they're confident enough to say no, listen, I'm not confident enough to say no as much as I would like to say, you know, but that's definitely a skill that they have to learn, and I feel like a lot of parenting is reactive, right? So we're trying to cure the sins of our parents and try to be the best versions of ourselves. So.
This has been really great, so I appreciate all the dialogue that's been going on. I have two questions, I guess. One is, Professor Stone, I'm just wondering how the concept of microaggressions fits into your descriptions of the pains that you did such a great job of talking about in each one of the chapters. And then secondly, kind of dovetails on what you all were just talking about and the point that you know, the woman back there just brought up. And that's, you know, how do we teach our kids about microaggressions? And it's just, you know, I always tell my son, you know, who's, you know, second grader here, you know, Jaden, and to lead with kindness, you know, and to, you know, not gossip, do things like that. But it's really tough. It's really tough to teach them because there's still so much id going on right there. So if you could just speak to both of those
And
things.
and let's face it, I mean, for being real, not everyone around you is going to be worthy of kindness all the time. And it's true. Like they're not always with. I mean, this is like the best room of people ever, but that's not always where we get to situate ourselves in the work. Certainly not in the workplace, right? And hopefully we try to surround our kids with the best people, make them feel, but they don't always have that. I think microaggressions are a huge part. And again, it's a death by 1,000 paper cuts thing. I think just hearing it, I think just understanding that certain things should hit your ear a little differently. It just starts with that. So like when somebody says, oh, that's the new lady mayor, like it just, we don't have to say that she's just the mayor, but things start to sound a little, they're little, but that's why they're called microaggressions, because they're so small. But if we are inundated with them every day, it builds up. There is an erosion.
I was asked today, I'm 42 years old. I've been practicing law since 2007 with I currently work for the state of Florida. We have someone coming in tomorrow for a sworn statement via subpoena. They are mandated to be here. The 2 male attorneys from their side, we were supposed to start at 9, now we're starting at 11. We were supposed to end at 5, now we're ending at 4. They have things, they're very important, they're very busy. And at about 3 o'clock this afternoon, he asked me what I will be getting him for lunch. To which I said, I won't stop you from eating a sandwich that you pick up on your walk over here. But that was a micro, and to me, them chipping away, they knew that we had that time. They are under subpoena. Would they ever, in a million years, do that to a male attorney? So all me and my co-counsel, who is a brilliant woman, we were just laughing, going through the discovery, and I'm convinced that they were doing this to distract us today so we couldn't focus on preparing. I think that they knew that their case is shot, and this was just some BS, swinging contest, which I look forward to winning. But I mean, today, I'm literally preparing for this, and I'm like, you have got to be kidding me with this nonsense. And I literally just went to my coworker's office and just said, did he ask me to get him a sandwich? Like, did this really just happen today? Yes, it happens.
The other big thing that happens a lot is people will literally say to themselves or to people they feel comfortable with, and again, that's the key, would that have been said to a man? And really ask. And what I've seen that I think is helping, there are people.
Spoiler, never.
Well, right, but there are people who are standing up more and more. Someone it just happened in a situation I'm familiar with where someone stood up and said, actually, I do have apparently privilege, because when I said that, nobody blinked twice, but she said it, and now that was a problem. I think we have to shed some light on this. People aren't always willing to stand up and say, I have privilege and I want to be your comparator, but that's the only way we're going to achieve social justice.
Judge? Have you ever been asked to get someone a sandwich?
Yes, my husband on a daily basis. Okay, I want to preface my remarks by saying, I find in my line of work, I'm a judge in family court, and we have what we call relative adoption. When you have children coming from Guatemala, coming from Cuba, coming from El Salvador, CABA, the Cuban American Bar Association, brings them to us to validate them being in the United States. These kids were abused, abandoned, and neglected. They come to the Anglo judges, they tell me, because we're much more sympathetic and will sign the orders much more readily than those of Hispanic descent. My question for you, what about the woman judge or the woman boss who pretends that they're from the 1950s, from Leave It to Beaver, with Wally's mom, who served the tea and served, because there's that mindset is there. How do you deal with that? How should I, as a man, deal with that, with colleagues who were back in the 1950s? Because it's very, very frustrating. But before you answer that, I need to say, Kerri is on our board of directors. Michelle is one of our vice presidents, and they're incredibly helpful to me during my year and a half now as year's president. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Judge. And thank you for listening to me. Thank you for when I open my mouth at those meetings, you don't immediately shut it down. I very much appreciate your ears. And thank you. It's a problem, and it's a problem in a lot of ways too, because women can be our own worst enemy, and it's interesting. So, what was it? There was a Netflix documentary about abortion, and I'm not going to get into the politics of it, but it was talking about how the political momentum to overturn Roe. I think it's actually called Overturning Roe. It's on Netflix right now. Don't miss it. But they were talking about how there was a case that went in front of the court that, oh my gosh.
Which one?
Justice O'Connor. It was one of her first cases. And the issue was going to be, was Justice O'Connor going to overturn Roe? Because she was very conservative and she was put in by Reagan. And she actually defended Roe. And that was a huge shock to a lot of people. And they were saying the reason she upheld Roe was because she was a woman, not because she believed in Roe, but because she didn't want to be the first woman on the bench and her first task to be overturning Roe. So I think with those women, we need to think about, are they in a mindset of the 1950s Leave It to Beaver mentality of how society should be? Or are they overcompensating in a way? In the same way that, as you know, a lot of former public defenders, when they get on the bench, are the hardest on the alleged victims because they're trying to show that they don't have those sympathies. So perhaps if we make it a safe space, right, to be fair, as opposed to a perpetual proving ground where they have to show again and again and again how they're not biased because of X, Y, or Z. Rabbi, were you going to say something?
Please.
I would just say, I think that there's something to this like a mindset of scarcity.
Yes.
Because there are so few women or people of color or out individuals or trans individuals in these high positions that often like it feels so tenuous. So I think that there's a subconsciousness of this mindset of scarcity instead of what, Kerri, you were talking about before and you highlighted, Michelle, from her book of like really mentoring and bringing people up. And I was thinking about, Kerri, when you said, if you have very diverse boards and very diverse staffs that people are going to notice it, that's the hope. But you need more than one person.
Right.
Like I said it to Andrea. I was like, the woman in the room needs another woman in the room to look at, because you know what? The man of color might not notice it.
Could you imagine going into the Supreme Court every day having, and I'm saying this facetiously, but having to be the wise Latina?
Right.
That's a lot.
And as being tokenized,
Yeah.
like I grew up as a token, but being a lady rabbi, I think that there is a little bit of possessiveness and thinking of scarcity instead of abundance, and thinking of like, now that I'm here, I have to make sure the ground is firm, instead of now that I'm here, I'm going to make sure the ground is porous. There was one other thing I wanted to add, but I'll think about it.
To that point, Judge, I would be really interested in a study, Professor, of whether, because I know that to be absolutely true in state court, and I would be curious as whether it's similar in federal court, where they have a lifetime appointment and they don't have to worry about re-election and the PBA and all of the different associations.
That's why we have tenure. That's exactly why we have tenure, so we can write and we can speak freely. I'll say also, it does come into play with mentoring. We have to stop putting people in boxes. We have to stop saying, oh, you're the new young Latina associate. I know just who your mentors. Why? We have to stop putting people in boxes and expecting certain things of them to begin with.
The other thing I wanted to highlight, which is on this, is really the importance then of the ally.
Yes.
And how things really change when our allies step up. So I have an example from just 2 weeks ago. Of course, it's about Roe v. Wade again. There was there was a local news station, CBS 4, wanted to talk about how does Judaism define the beginning of life. And one of my male colleagues who was interviewed for this said, "Who are the other rabbis you're talking to?" And he noticed that they were all men. And he said to the interviewer, "I really hope that you as a man are not only talking to men about what women should do with their bodies."
I love that.
Bravo. Yes.
Love
and,
that.
and you know what? I gave him a shout out on we have a Facebook page for all CCAR rabbis. I gave him a shout out. It was the biggest love fest. There were over 100 unique people posting about how proud they were of him. So always finding, allies, and also telling the allies like what we need. Like if you hear the sexist comment, like we need you to say it, because if we say it, then people are just gonna not want to talk around us, right?
And in different contexts, different people can step up and be allies. That's the other thing, so.
Judge?
Yeah, I got another judge here. I should preface this by telling you that I'm the one responsible for training every judge in the state of Florida on gender bias and racial bias and all different kinds of things.
Wow.
I've been doing these trainings for almost 20 years.
Wow.
There are structural problems, and I mean physical structural problems. Like, for example, the courthouse I started practicing in had 3 times as many bathrooms for men as it did for women.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's just a structural problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the reasons that I insisted and pushed for getting lactation rooms built in every one of our courthouses, because I didn't think it was appropriate for women lawyers or litigants, frankly, but particularly women lawyers, to have to choose between should I have a family or a career. You're welcome to make a choice, but you shouldn't have to make a choice simply because of the structure of the building that you're working in. I had a situation last year where I was required to police the behavior of some lawyers who were appearing in front of me. And a male lawyer had used some extremely derogatory information directed to a woman lawyer. And it came to my attention, and I started to talk about it. I'm very comfortable talking about this stuff because I teach it.
Mm-hmm.
And this woman lawyer, her eyes got huge, and she's like, please, she did not want it discussed. And I had a courtroom full of people, and I had to decide on the spot. It was clear to me she wasn't comfortable with it.
Yeah.
And I thought, I have a responsibility that's bigger than that as a judge sitting on the bench. And I dressed down the lawyer, and I made him write a letter of apology. And I made him start engaging in some ethics training to learn new behaviors. And I went to the woman attorney afterwards, and I said, I really didn't mean to put you on the spot, but my responsibility is bigger than just your case. I don't think that woman lawyer has ever forgiven me. And we talked about it later, and she's like, but I still have to work with him, and I still have a case, and it's a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
I was aware of what I was doing at the time, and I would do it again tomorrow, because I think my responsibility is bigger than one case.
Yeah.
But I never realized until I heard you talking earlier exactly where she was coming from.
Wow.
I didn't get it. I thought she was just afraid. And I think that it's much bigger than that. I think it's because she was, I'm projecting here, acculturated to believe that that's the way she's supposed to behave. So thank you for bringing that to my attention, because I never really appreciated where she was coming from.
Thank you for showing us what it looks like when this stuff is actualized, Your Honor.
This is the
But
point. This is the point.
No, but I mean, it can be done. One of the other things that I do, when I train on implicit bias, which I don't know if all of you know about implicit bias, but it's what you're talking about, this fog that we all live through, that we walk through, that we've grown up with, media images and things like that, the way that we were raised. I insist in my courtroom that every lawyer refer to every other lawyer by their last name, because I was finding that the male lawyers were calling the female lawyers by their first name. And it's just unnecessary in a professional context. But I realized I can't just correct male lawyers when they do it. So if it's going to, because I may miss one if I try to select when to do it. So the rule in my courtroom is that every lawyer has to call every other lawyer by their last name. And if I have 2 male lawyers or 2 female lawyers, I stop them and I say, my policy is that everyone does it as a bias interrupter for gender bias. And I may know these lawyers are good friends. And it's like, you want to go have a drink after the hearing? Great. In the courtroom, in a professional setting, you must use last names across the board. That's an example of a bias interrupter. Do you know of any other bias interrupters that can be done to deal with this problem?
This is great.
That's a really good one. Also, from the point of view of a client, I would always do that as well, because when I was a PD, at least, we didn't want our clients to think that we were too chummy with the state attorneys. Now, a lot of times it was beneficial if we were friendly because we got better deals. But if you already thought you're being paid by the state, anyhow, the point is, but I think that's great both for the clients and for the party. Give me a stereotype. Let's talk about it, you know? Rabbi?
Can I just, one that I gave to, I was mentoring a newly minted rabbi, and he had a baby, and the cantor, who was a female at the same congregation, also had a baby. There was a third clergy person, and he said he wasn't going to take his paternity leave. And I said, because she needs to be home, this is what he said, because she needs to be home with the baby, and I want to respect that. I said, if you really respect her, you will not only take your paternity leave, but you will take as much as you can. And I think, like, you know, that's something too, like, when we're talking about, like, whether the gender, like, for men to take vacation days, for men to pick up the kids from school, for men, like, you know, when, who was it who asked? Like, somebody asked, like, will this ever happen? Oh, you asked. Will this ever happen without domestic parity? Like, no, right?
First of all, thank you, both of you, for doing this tonight. I think we are so lucky to be members of this congregation and members of this school where there are so many powerful and working women that set examples for our children. And, like, if you go out into just the general community, like, this doesn't take place elsewhere, where half of the class has women physicians as mothers, you know.
Actually, I think, in our class where we have children in common, the first year, I think there were like 12 students, and 20 of the parents were physicians.
Yes. And
it was ridiculous.
And a lot of them women, and that doesn't happen elsewhere. And so not only are we setting an excellent example for our kids that women can be, you know, leaders and mothers and physicians and do, you know, everything that they want to do. You know, so I think we're the force for the future, but unfortunately I don't think that the rest of the world really looks like we do here. So I just wanted to say a couple things. One is, I agree with you that we will never reach equality unless there is domestic equality. Some days, you know, I do more of the parenting than my husband does, and other days he does more of the parenting than I do, and that's what a partnership is, especially in a household where there's 2 working parents. And so I think that in order to make it successful, you need an equal partner, whether the partner is a physician or not a physician. Each person has to hold their own weight in a 2 working parent family. And, like, even with all of the working mothers that we have in our classes, if you look at the room chat, it's all moms. And I specifically added my husband to the room chat because I need him there sometimes to know what's going on. But it's shocking that there's no other dads on that room chat. And so we do it for ourselves a little bit, having this mom chat for the classes where the dads are not involved. And I still receive the emails and the phone calls from the, you know, whoever the daily nurse is these days, of, like, Silver's ear hurts, and I'm like, thanks, you know, like, did you call my husband, you know? Anyway, so yes, we need more domestic equality to, keep pushing forward. And I just want to, the other thing was, outside of this forum, I think you're preaching to the choir, and a lot of what you're saying is still eye-opening, and I want to read the book, but how do we get this out there to the masses, because if you really want to initiate change, it can't just be us, and it can't just be books and Coral Gables, which is also probably preaching to the choir. But you need to get it out there further, and so ideas as to how you can take your show on the road, and let other people know, about your book. And I think it's really important to keep pushing this forward into the wider community outside of our bubble of Beth.
So, excellent points, and I agree. And I think we go home and we talk to our kids about it, and we get them excited about the things that they can do. I think that with Instagram and Facebook and all of these things, and this is by no means a novel point, but our world now is in like 10-second sound bites. And what I love about Kerri's book is that it's literally bullet pointed into like, here are some pains, think about these, do better, teach people, find more, Alyssa? Sorry, was someone back there? Was it not you?
Me.
Oh, sorry, Michelle, sorry.
Okay. So one of my children is in the same class that Star was just talking about, and I was thinking about that earlier, about how her husband is the only one in our class chat. And then he was voluntold. And then
We're going to make fetch happen with that word.
And then we also had a soccer team this year, and I'm just so used to the moms being in the chat, and my husband, one day I said to him, oh, there was this great picture from the game in our group chat, I have to show it to you. He says, oh, I saw it. I said, you're in that chat? Yeah. I'm like, oh, I didn't realize, like, even if he works so much, he just doesn't have time to chime in, but he was paying attention. And he was reading and watching and following when he could, and I didn't even realize he was there. And shame on me for not putting him in that class chat.
Well, I think, Gary's actually my husband's actually in our class chat, and I only found out recently that he had WhatsApp. I only found out last week that he was in the group chat when he like chimed in on something, and it was the same deal. It was like, wait, you're here? I'm here. I didn't know you were here. And incidentally, my husband is a pediatrician, and the nurse of the day still calls me, and I feel like I'm an operator from 1926. I'm like, please hold for Dr. Kramer, and then I like plug it in and connect them, and what is the point of this? I also have things to do.
Sorry, one more sort of tapping into both Judge, now in doctor mode again, Judge Bernstein's comment, and then also going back to Dr. Mountner's comment. In experience, well, first of all, I find that I am the token working mother here, so I think that classroom might be unique.
It's a really good one. It's a really good one.
But a situation that continually unfolds, and I guess my question is, who would be the person to intercede, to have the intervention? Is me being the only female in a discussion, in a meeting, potentially even the only physician, and being called by my first name. And everyone else is Mr. So-and-so or Dr. So-and-so if it's a man, but it's always Kate. And I could have, I have 15 years of Ivy League training, and it still is Kate.
We have the same thing at work.
And so I guess my question is, I've just kind of let it go, and I'm very informal. I'm a New Yorker, and so in New York, all the hospitals, we go by our first names, so I'm fine with that. But I guess where does the interventions, who should be the one to be like, no, that's not okay that it gets to be Mr. So-and-so, but it's not even Dr. Kate? Who should be the one intervening to say that's inappropriate?
I think
it should be someone else, not you.
I would say you reach out to the person who's in charge of that meeting privately, and you say, please start calling me Dr. Lampensacker, because the leader has to lead so that other people will set the example. and make sure that every single time that person addresses you, that's how they address you. And if that doesn't work, I mean, you know, but you also, I know the situation you're talking about, and it's harder the longer you go on, because you've been in that situation for years now, and it's gone on and on and on, and you don't want to stand up and be like, actually, it's Dr. Lampensacker. Now, a man could absolutely say that, but the way for, unfortunately, this is a pain. Give it to a man in that particular, you know, unfortunately, in that situation, the person who in charge is a man, not unfortunately, but it is, and I hate to say give it to a man to transmit that message, but in your case, it's a man. Generally speaking, I'm saying give it to the leader of the group.
Well, or do you say, no, go big, and this needs to be a culture change at an entire institution, so it has to come from the top down, and so go all the way to the top to insist it, or do you just take it group by group?
So there are professors at my school, women professors, who've taken, when nobody comes to help them out in that way, which would be so helpful, who've taken to kind of responding to emails by signing, and I have not had the courage to do this, I'll admit it. And Jen, you could probably speak to some of this too, right? Some people have taken to signing things, see you later, sincerely, Professor Stone. But like, I have trouble with myself in the third person like that. Like, it's awkward and it's hard, and you don't want to be that person, and I think that's very understandable. But ideally, it should be somebody else. Sometimes there are ways to, like, awkwardly, like, have occasion to refer to yourself in the third person. So if you're, like, making an example and you say, so hypothetically, if the patient comes in tomorrow and they want to see Dr. Goldberg and Dr. Lampensacker and Dr. So-and-so, we're just going to have to, and you find, like, awkward ways to work it in so people hear it and they're like, oh, she doesn't think of herself that way. And you shouldn't have to. I mean, that's what undergirds all this. You shouldn't have to, but.
I say do whatever you feel comfortable with.
Yeah.
And you know, you're an awesome mom to two young girls who are watching you. Yep. And I think that'd be pretty cool for you to be able to talk to them about how you stood up and said, give me the respect that I deserve. And you're not doing it in any way that a man hasn't had the privilege of being handed to him.
I mean, didn't we have a headline about this with Dr. Biden not long ago? And everyone said she was so into her title. You know, I mean, we have to combat this, because then we're not only that person in our own eyes, now we have to become that person in everyone else's eyes. And we have to say, but I had to do that and no one else here did. So now you see me in this. It's just this very difficult thing, which is why we need allies.
I want to just add to that. I'm just finishing my tenure as the president of the Rabbinic Association of Greater Miami. So we're all rabbis. So people use first names all the time, right? Because you're amongst colleagues. I always call women rabbi last name, always, when I'm running a meeting, because of years of sitting there being a rabbi and hearing the men be called by their last names and the women by their first. So I'm just trying to, like, set a norm and give the women the kavod. I don't know if there are other female doctors in this group or whatever, but that it's like one way of showing, like, no, this is how you treat a woman.
This has been, sorry, go ahead.
Just along the themes of allyship, we've spoken or heard you guys speak quite a bit about opening the doors for women, and we've started speaking about men and bring them into the conversation. And Dr. Montner, you mentioned that with your husband being part of the chat. And I was just curious, what more can we do? You spoke about paternity leave. My son's here at Beth, my boys are here, and it's always the room mom, not the room parent. We're not celebrating Father's Day here at Beth within the day school. We celebrated Mother's Day. Just curious, more structurally, what can we do to bring men and make it a more, I guess, unified?
I struggled with this a lot. I spent 5 years as the primary homemaker, and I felt less than to the working moms, and I felt, and a lot of this was imposed upon myself, but also a great deal of pressure to be the best darn stay-at-home mom you can possibly be, and take on everything, and not worry that my husband, make sure that my husband knew that everything was going to be taken care of, because that was my job and that's what I was going to do. And it's interesting because I had kids, and I didn't leave the workforce until my youngest was about 2. And now coming back into the workforce, I'm so much more confident in handing him much more than he did before I went away the first time. Because being a stay-at-home parent is incredibly difficult, and there is no glory, and there is no appreciation, and what these men and women do who stay home is absolutely incredible. They need to be given the same freedom as parents who work outside of the home to hand the reins to their partner. And it's what we were talking about with domestic parity. Just because the mom can do it all doesn't mean that she should, and doesn't mean that it should be expected of her. So I'm my own worst case scenario. I didn't know my husband was on the group chat. Now, if I ask him to do anything, he would do it in a heartbeat, but I have to ask him to do it, right? So I think what we need to do is raise the level of what we expect. And again, raise the level of what your children see you expect of your spouse. Make the lunches, write the notes, schedule the meetings, take them to the play date. Do all of the things that have traditionally been just expected of a mother, whether she's in the home or not, and make that the norm. And I think it's great in theory to say we can change the world, but I know I have the power to change 2 lives, and those are ripples that are, mine are going to change the world, obviously, but we all have the power to affect the lives that we have the power to affect, and you never know the impact your children, your nieces, your nephews are going to have on the next generation.
I agree. Just normalize calling everybody by the last. It's just exactly what you said. Just normalize the term room parent. Normalize all of it until it's not.
And we did have one. Stuart Dabowski was a room parent like 2 or 3 years ago. It was a big deal. It shouldn't be a big deal. It's ridiculous that it's a big deal.
Should we thank everybody?
Yeah. So we were going to talk about the Amber Heard trial, but I feel like we've taken this too far.
We can do that over refreshments.
So I'm just going to throw out one very unpopular opinion because it needs to be said. The Amber Heard trial is excellent for women. Here is why. If you have not already, watch Camille Vasquez's closing argument, because that is going to so many women, I think, are going to want to go to law school to see what this woman has been able to do. She is so incredible. And we don't have perfect, I'm not even getting into Amber Heard. We don't have perfect victims. We don't have perfect crimes. We don't have perfect cases. But sometimes you have a perfect lawyer. Watch her. She is incredible. So thank you, Kerri, so much for your scholarship, for writing this book. It's really amazing. And I have to say, Kerri is very, very accessible. So if you have any questions, if you have any, I'm voluntelling you. But you can reach out to her. I know very little about very little. So Kerri knows a lot about a lot. So absolutely reach out to her because she has a lot to say and a lot you can learn from her.
I want to thank you guys just for listening, letting us do this. Michelle, you are inimitable. You are inimitable. You are a force. And thank you for joining me up here. Rabbi, where's the rabbi? You're amazing. We take it for granted that we go to a synagogue that has a social justice speaker series. It's just, you've created so many opportunities for so many of these discussions. And every time I leave one, I think about your words and the way you phrase things and the metaphors. And we're so lucky. Thank you so much.